Indie games are at the heart of the games industry, and often they push our very perception of what a video game can and can't be. I've always been fascinated by those driven by passion to pursue a project in the gaming industry, whether it be to tell a story they want to tell, relive and replicate a lost era of gaming, or just simply create something that they and many others can enjoy. In this episode, I sat down with Irish indie developer Dan McGrath to talk all things games, DreadX, and what he's working on. With that being said, please sit back, relax, and welcome to Indie Insight. Dan, thanks a million for joining me today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. I think probably riding off the success of DreadX Collection The Hunt, which I believe had at least by all accounts a very good release, and is probably the best collection that DreadXP have produced to date. I know they put an emphasis on putting a lot of work into having, say, the I suppose game jam-esque sort of style go from the normal 7 to 10 nights all the way up to 20 with fewer developers to focus on this sort of branched out world, which I thought was fantastic. By the way, I was lucky enough to get a code early on to give the game a review, so I was holding my tongue for ages to try and not give away anything to a lot of people I was talking to about it. So I kind of want to start off first of all because I got introduced, the only reason I got introduced to your work was first of all through DreadXP, and then it's kind of a blessing in disguise really, because a lot of the time when you mention game development in Ireland, people who really, I suppose, unless you're really, really into it, and I wouldn't describe myself as someone who's constantly on the sort of lookout for stuff in Ireland, game development in Ireland really isn't something that's particularly, I suppose, brought into the spotlight as opposed to, say, different bits of media. Granted, I think we probably both agree, outside of maybe the odd like Love Hate or Black 47, there's very rarely or even The Guard is another example, like very rarely there is examples of Irish film or TV breaking out into the mainstream as well. But with that being said, I think since kind of seeing your game, I think it's just been a sort of a general spiral of finding other Irish developers. I think I recently stumbled across through Steam as well Dark Side Detective, which is made by a group over in Drogheda as well. So I was like, oh my god, they're all coming at me right now. It's a great game. So I kind of want to actually, I will say one thing. The only reason I kind of, well, obviously, bar the fact that your name's Dan McGrath, the only other way I was able to find out that your name was that you were an Irish developer was the fact that the achievement for completing the House of Unrest on the DreadX collection is Down With This Sort of Thing, which to those who aren't well acquainted, I believe is a very popular reference to Father Ted in Ireland. So I thought it was a nice bit of, I suppose, a homage of sorts. And I suppose, I don't know if Father Ted would be considered probably the priest in question in the House of Unrest, but I suppose along a similar line.
It could be canon. I'm not sure just yet.
Do we know if the House of Unrest is on Craggy Island? That is the question, Dan.
That's a good question. Time will tell.
Time will tell. Let's first of all kind of get acquainted with you first of all. How did you first initially get into games? What were your sort of earliest memories, maybe popular games you enjoyed or stuff that really kind of caught your eye?
Oh God. I think my earliest memories of games, I was actually thinking about this the other day. I remember my cousin had a Sega. Or a Sega, if you want to pronounce it that way. And I remember him playing, I think it was an NBA Jam on it and Sonic the Hedgehog on it. And I remember thinking, I just didn't understand it. I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen in my life. And I didn't really understand it. And I think I remember my cousin giving us his Sega once he'd grown up and he was kind of sick of it. And we kind of played that. And then kind of after that, then it was kind of the PlayStation 1. I remember my dad getting us a PlayStation 1, and then that was just mind-blowing, and it comes across, and a lot of the stuff I do now is kind of trying to recapture that kind of that low poly kind of weird kind of aesthetic. So that's kind of how I got into games, and I kind of just went on from there. You know, and then I think one of the first games I was really, really into was I think it was about 6 or 7, and we had this old DOS computer, and I was playing played Doom on it, and Doom scared the daylights out of me, but I loved it. I didn't understand what was going on, but I absolutely loved it. Doom and Wolfenstein were my first two like go-to games, and I still play them to this day. But yeah, the interest kind of spiraled from there. But I think that was kind of my first kind of exposure to games.
Yeah, I think the good thing about sort of Doom and Wolfenstein is, you don't need to be very apt or able to identify the story elements that are going on in those games to enjoy them, even today, with the release of most recent Doom Eternal. A question I always like to ask people when they're involved in game development, and I'm particularly interested to get your thoughts on this, is, do games capture you more based on sort of the gameplay aspect of them, or is it the case that, I think we're seeing a lot more recently now that people really get into games for the story element of them? I think The Last of Us is a very good example of this. It's very much story driven with elements of gameplay that aren't, particularly revolutionary, but are, just kind of tacked on in certain elements. Is that something which would you kind of prefer more, or would it be a mix of both?
I think it's a mix of both. I think I'm super into what I refer to as the walking simulators. So things like Dear Esther and What Remains of Edith Finch. I love those games, and those are very, very much story based. I love those, but then at the same time, I really like gameplay heavy games with kind of minimal story. So it's actually kind of a bit of both, to be honest.
And so, was there? Obviously, I'll have to first of all come out the gates. It's poor form from me. The only game I've played of yours at the moment is House of Unrest, but I do plan to delve into your library a lot more extensively in the coming days and weeks. But is a large level of your inspiration for creating games, is it primarily focused on story first or gameplay first, or is it you just see, depending on which game you're doing, it kind of evolves or whatnot?
It usually depends on the type of game that I'm doing. A lot of them, I kind of start off with a very kind of basic idea, and they evolve or transform over time. Like some of my games started off as shooters, and they turned into story-based, almost just walking simulators. Like I have 1 or 2 games that were going to be shooters. They're just literally walking simulators. There's just a story being told. There's very kind of minimal gameplay. Which they evolved quite a bit over time. A lot of the earlier stuff though is very much gameplay based. I'm trying to get like mechanics down and things like that. But I think I got more comfortable over time being like, I'd prefer to tell a story, because I'm not the best, I would say, at designing gameplay. I kind of want to make something and put it out as soon as I can. Because I don't really want to spend like 6 months working on a mechanic, because I will get sick of it and I'll get bored. So I try and make something and put it out as soon as possible. So yeah.
What kind of got you, like, obviously there's a big difference for a lot of people between being into games and enjoying to play them, and then going off and making a game. There's a huge gap in between those. What kind of got you into game development?
I think the very first kind of exposure I think I had to it was a neighbor of mine. I was at his house, and he had this kind of, on his PC, he had this kind of top-down dungeon crawler kind of game, and he was after editing the sprites and stuff, and I was like, you can't do that. I was like, wait, what have you done? And he'd like put himself into the game, and he'd drawn a little pixel art and stuff. And my mind I was just like, oh my god. I was like, I can do this. And I went home and I tried to do it myself, and I started doing things in Paint, and I started like drawing guys in Paint and being like, oh, if I can move them around, maybe I can make my own game. So that was kind of like my first kind of like, oh, I could do this. And then that went away then for years. And then in around, I think it was like 2004, 2005. Are you familiar with the DVD that came with Halo 2?
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah, the making of Halo 2. So I didn't know really how games were made. I just kind of thought some guys got into a room of computers and out came a game. I had no idea like how things were set up, how 3D models worked, anything like this. And I remember after I'd finished the game, I watched it, and there was all these dudes, hanging out, drawing on whiteboards and coding and like moving around these worlds and moving models. And I immediately was like, I want to do this. This sounds fucking cool. So that was kind of my exposure to it then. And then I kind of didn't really look into it because I didn't know how, or like it wasn't really heard in Ireland anyway. It wasn't heard of, at all. There was no, we didn't have a Bungie or an Activision or, Blizzard over here until about maybe 2011 when there was a college course in Cork, and I went to that then, and I was kind of exposed to it fully. And ever since then now it's kind of been like, it's been a part-time kind of passion almost, you could say.
And so obviously with that then, I kind of want to touch on, before we sort of delve in a little bit more into your sort of wide library of games, I want to kind of first touch on House of Unrest, which is the game you developed for most recent DreadX Collection, Collection The Hunt. DreadXP, I think, are building up a fairly good reputation, particularly, well, I suppose solely for the indie horror market. They've attracted some huge names, likes of David Szymanski is obviously one that I think a lot of, what's the word you'd use for it? Boomer shooter, low poly fans would be sort of aware of. John Szymanski as well is also a very good one as well. And Torpil Duke, I think he's done all 4 of the DreadX collections at this stage.
He's done all 4 now.
Yeah. So where did they how were you first of all approached by the team at DreadXP to get involved? Did they see one of your previous works and they were like, we'd love you to jump on, or was it kind of you reached out to them, or how did it work?
So it was July last year when I first got into contact with them. Now I can't remember if I got onto them or if they got onto me. I think I remember seeing something about the second DreadX collection, and I was on Twitter, I think it was, and I was kind of like, oh, I'd love to get. I think I must have responded to the trailer or something saying, oh, I'd love to get involved in something like this. Just not even being like, hey guys, like I was just kind of like, oh, this would be cool to do someday, And I think it was Airdorf, the guy who made, have you seen the Fate games?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so Airdorf replied to me and he kind of tagged Star, who is the community manager for DreadX. And I think she DM'd me and it kind of was like, oh, would you be interested, kind of thing. And I said, yeah. I said, whenever, the next one is up. But they were essentially booked up for the third one. So they said, oh, we'll speak to you about the fourth one, hopefully at the start kind of 2021, maybe end of 2020. And then it was kind of radio silence from then on. So I kind of thought, that like the thing, like, when opportunities arise, sometimes they kind of, they fizzle out, So I had no issue with not being on it. I was just kind of, oh, that was cool. We got to interact with them. And then they kind of got back onto me then in December, saying, would you like to be on the fourth collection? I was like, oh, absolutely. And we kind of had a call and a talk about it, and they told me who was the director, and I nearly fell out of my chair because I'm a big Dusk fan. But when they said, do you want to do it? I was like, absolutely. I had no idea why they picked me. But I'm glad that they did, because it was a great experience. But yeah, that's how it kind of happened.
Had second tape released at that stage, or was that after? They had got in contact with you.
So the first time, that time in July when I first kind of got interested, that was just before Harmful, the second tape, came out.
Okay.
Just before it. I imagine it had some contribution in them going ahead with it,
And obviously with this collection, they very much focused on the first-person shooter aspect. I know obviously one of them contains a camera and it's taking shooting quite literally. But was that sort of did you know that going into it that it was going to be first-person shooter focused, or did they kind of tell you that later on down the line?
We kind of knew. So on our first call, when I spoke with Ted, who kind of runs DrexB, he said the theme was going to be around kind of like earned hunters, and it was kind of like, before we start, just kind of think about it. It's going to be an FPS focused, hopefully, and around hunting.
And obviously, I think was it Airduff I saw on Twitter? I think he described House of Unrest as kind of first person Faith. I don't know how happy you are with that sort of comparison.
Yeah, initially I think it was like a lot of people were like, "Oh, it's Faith 3D," and I was like, "I'll take it. I was like, he's not going to sue me, is he? But yeah, I was okay with that. I was okay with being compared to that.
Yeah, I suppose if you're going to be compared to someone, be compared to the best, I suppose.
Yeah.
So obviously we talked to, I suppose I would highly doubt that, well, maybe it was. I'll let you answer this question, but what sort of was the main inspiration behind House of Unrest? Had you maybe looked at a few of the previous DreadX collections, maybe gotten an idea of what the sort of format was, or was it something completely that you had in back of your mind that you really wanted to do for it?
Great question. I had known for a while that I wanted to do a kind of a first-person exorcist type game. But when we initially, like my pitch for my game, so we had to pitch to DreadX. Everyone had to do a pitch, and my pitch is completely different from what the game is now. My pitch originally was this kind of, it was an exorcist game, but it was kind of more like a spooky kind of like Goosebumps-esque kind of cutesy kind of thing, where it was going to be kind of more story based. And that evolved kind of over time. So sorry, what was the question again?
So like what were the main inspirations behind the game?
So that was it, the main inspirations. So I suppose the main inspirations, so once it started evolving over time, once I started seeing what everyone else was doing as well, there was kind of definitely a kind of a moodier tone to everything. So my initial prototype changed completely for the better. So I kind of started going down a route where I was kind of looking for inspiration from things like, like the original Resident Evil, like the main hallway.
Yeah.
In House of Unrest, the main house is very, it's kind of a throwback to the kind of the main hallway in the Resident Evil mansion, and kind of the original kind of Alone in the Dark game, the DOS game, the heavily pixely kind of creepy looking thing. That was kind of the main inspiration behind it, and kind of just the puzzle aspects of Resident Evil. You're going all over the place to find these specific items hidden behind statues and underneath things, Those were kind of the main inspirations, I think, behind it. Were those two games in particular, I'd say.
Yeah, I think one thing I noticed from picking it up first of all was I could tell the one thing I had kind of, not that I had a problem with in the previous DreadX games, it's more of a personal thing because I can't take horror very well. I'm very prone to jump scares, like whenever it happens. So I'm probably maybe I'm the core audience people should be looking at for horror review stuff, because I get so scared at everything, but maybe that's a bad thing at the same time.
No, that's good. That's a good thing.
Because I remember, because I did an initial review of the first game for a small amateur website, Informed Pixel, that I'm still writing for. And it was just because they had the Steam code in the library, and I saw David Szymanski's name was on it. I was like, oh yeah, I'll give this a look. And I think it only settled in like afterwards. It's like, oh shit, these are like scary games I have to go through. Like, this is not my sort of cup of tea. Like, I pretty much put down Alien Isolation after an hour because I got scared by some pipes blowing up or something. So I was not in the right space for this. but I think I felt a lot more at home in this sense. I think there's an element of horror in the Hunt one, but it's very much, you kind of have that sense of reassurance because it's a first person shooter at the same time, because like it's not like sort of like this defenseless game. You majority of the time have a weapon of some sort to defend yourself. And I think the one thing I wanted to touch on, because I was trying to because my sister was on to me yesterday and she was saying like, oh, who are you interviewing tomorrow? I said, oh, I'm interviewing Dan McGrath. He's an indie developer in Ireland. And she's like, oh, what has he done? And I was just like, I was trying to explain what exactly House of Unrest was. I was like, okay, so you're this like guy who's going in to do an exorcism, but you have a cross, a pistol, and 2 AK-47s. and it's like, it sounds weird and wacky at the beginning, and then it's kind of, it has some sort of like very hard story driven elements, and then at the end it embraces like full on whack when you go and fight the but I think it's fantastic. I really enjoy it. And I think when you were going for that sort of pixely sort of style, I have to ask, the character models of the priests, do they look extremely creepy if they're not pixelated?
They do, yeah. So if you so it's a specific type of rendering. Like if you put it in, I think it's called Bilnir. I could be pronouncing that wrong. If you change it to that, it looks horrifying. It's like muddy, stretched face. But then in pixel, it looks hilarious.
Because
but it's actually funny is what people might not know about the game is the character model. There's actually a character model. Is the exact same, but it has a mustache instead. So for anyone watching, he has a mustache. The priest that you play.
With regards to, I kind of want to ask one question on this, and I don't know if this is my memory kind of lapsing a little bit. But when playing the game, the sort of, I don't know if you call them enemy NPCs. I feel like that kind of sucks the sort of horror element out of it. But like, was it intentional to have them be deathly silent? Because they really had in some cases to, like, if you're going around a corner, like I would walk into a room and not notice them. I'd be like, oh yeah, it's grand. Then I turn around and I would, have the shit scared out of me because they just are so silent.
Yeah. So they used to have like these footstep sounds. They were like these wet sloppies. I hated them, so I took them out because you'd just be standing in a hallway and you just hear behind you just this like plopping, and I was like, that's gross. And they used to be, if you're really close to them, they do these kind of like kind of stereotypical zombie kind of growling noises. And it was kind of a hard balance because I didn't want there to be jump scares, but I wanted it to be kind of like, you turn a corner, it's like, oh shit, they're there. So they, like, originally they were you could hear them from like 20 feet away. So I made it like, so you only hear them when you're very close. But it also kind of, from watching Let's Plays and streams and stuff, I think it was a good decision in the end because there's not a lot of jump scares in it, if any. So they add a lot to it, because their AI is also a bit wacky as well.
And the sort of the main song that's at the end of the game, was that by someone you knew who you reached out to, or was that kind of just you found it and you were like, let's put that in it?
Oh, that's by me.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't put it out just yet. I'm just it's a segment of a song that I hadn't finished yet, and I'm planning to put out I'm planning to put the soundtrack of the game up onto YouTube or Bandcamp at some point. But that will have that full song in it.
So taking Soul Developer to the extreme.
That's it. Yeah. That's what I do for all my stuff. I do kind of everything myself.
And was the music aspect of like creating an indie game, was that out of necessity that you did that, or was that something you just always had an interest in as well?
I've always had an interest in music. So like I like play guitar and stuff like that. But like in between, when I'm doing kind of indie stuff or doing game stuff in my spare time, I also kind of do a lot of music stuff as well. I don't have a lot of stuff posted anywhere, so because I'd be more critical of that than I would be of my game. So I kind of felt like you needed it. I mean, that scene at the end definitely needed that big metal guitar in it for sure. But yeah. Sometimes though it is out of necessity, I think. But I always try and put in music where I can.
I suppose final question on House of Unrest before I move on. What was for you through the process of developing it? What was the most difficult part of working on it?
Most difficult part. I think the initial kind of the flow of the house. I suppose, like the puzzles. Where do I hide this key? Where do I put here? So it doesn't become boring, or like, the player has to go, oh, for God's sake, I have to go back outside again, or I have to go upstairs again, that kind of thing. So trying to keep it interesting the whole way through it. And enemy placement was a big thing as well, because I didn't want to put an enemy here because it'd be annoying you and all this kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
I think that, and the ending as well, because I nearly didn't go with that ending. That was supposed to be an Easter egg ending, with the two guns, and getting that initial scene, getting the feel of it right, and making it cool yet cheesy was difficult as well. Without seeming like it was shoehorned in. I think those were kind of the two most difficult aspects of it, I think.
Yeah. As we mentioned, obviously at the beginning, you're obviously an Irish developer. I think you're still living in Ireland, are you?
I am, yes.
Yeah. So, as we mentioned at the beginning, the games industry in Ireland isn't exactly, as big as it would be as, say, in the US or even in the UK. You wouldn't have any sort of standout real big development studios. You'd have some fairly well established ones. I think Ireland has a good few developers with regards to the mobile market. And little bits of indie as well. But outside of that, you won't find much out of. I think Blizzard and Activision have headquarters or offices here I think in Dublin, but outside of that, not so much. With that in mind, how have you found, sort of running an indie platform and creating games in Ireland? Do you think it's put you at a distinct disadvantage to maybe other indie developers that might be in the US or the UK, or does it really not make that much of a difference at the sort of the current level?
I think, like I don't do it full time, so I don't think it's put me at a disadvantage. I kind of just I don't think being from Ireland or anything like that has put a kind of a hindrance on my work at all. It's something that's not really brought up. It's kind of hard question to answer, really.
Internet speeds don't play a part in how poor it is.
Yeah, that's it. I just put it up and don't tell anyone where I'm from. Usually, when they find out I'm from Ireland, it's a big surprise. They're like, "Whoa," I don't think they know that we have electricity here.
You mentioned that you've obviously been like, anyone who looks at your library has known that you've been doing games for a long time now. Even I suppose there's stuff that you've worked on that probably isn't on your itch.io account as well. Like, what would you say at the current moment has been your proudest moment in your career?
Proudest moment? Oh God. I would say, I would honestly say, the release of the DreadX collection by far. I've had so many nice messages and really nice reviews on the collection itself, and individually my work as well. I think it's definitely been my proudest moment. It's my first thing that's on Steam. I'd always kind of aspired to have something on Steam. Obviously, it's not just mine. It's on a collection, but it's alongside some really cool developers. So I think it's definitely been my proudest moments by far. It's been really cool.
And just to get a sort of an insight into because obviously I think this is the first time DreadXP had partnered with David to publish a game together. Was there a lot of oversight from DreadXP and David as to how the game sort of progressed and developed, or how it was going to be shipped? Like, did they offer support in certain areas, or was it solely just you were left for it?
So Dave was the director, and Dave was there pretty much all along the way from when we start, from like day one. He was there. He was kind of available for feedback. We did a lot of kind of one-on-one sessions where he would play your game and you would watch him, and you would sit there twiddling your thumbs and sweating and being like, "Oh my god," being like, "Please don't break." No, but he was there, and Ted and Star and all the QA folk were all there kind of along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And they're fantastic to work with. They're so easygoing. But they did have a lot of input. They would offer suggestions and feedback and say, this area doesn't flow as well, or something like that, or maybe you should put this over here. I had a lot of that helped along the way. We would have kind of like QA streams where we'd have someone from the QA team. He would stream the game, and a couple of people would come in on Discord and we'd watch, and we kind of pick things apart, which was a lot of fun and really helpful. And I think it was really important as well for those things, because you kind of have to check your ego a small bit at the door. Because I think a lot of people, for me anyway, when I first started seeing anyone make a video of my game, I'd be pulling my hair, because they're like, oh, they're not playing it the way that I want them to play it. But then having QA behind you and someone like Dave as a director, they can pick apart those things and say, well, players aren't going to understand this because they're not you. You need to make them understand or help them understand. So they were there kind of all along the way, which was super, super helpful. I don't think House of Unrest would have been as good if they weren't. If it had just been left to me and I'd be given all that time, I think I would have had an absolute Frankenstein game come out at the end. But yeah.
You mentioned there just a bit earlier on about like how this was your first game that was on Steam. Is there? I'd say I obviously don't know the full workings around how a game gets on Steam and whatnot, but is there a reason as to why the rest of your titles aren't on Steam at the moment?
I've held off for a while now because I just don't think my games are long enough to put on there. A lot of my games are anywhere from a 30-minute experience to maybe an hour, maybe an hour and a half. So I've never kind of felt. I always say to myself, "Oh, the next project I'll put onto Steam." It's just something I haven't really gotten around to. Even like I even thought of putting one of the games up there for free, but people would still complain. They're like, I've seen people complain about games being 2 hours long, and they're free, I think it's just. I think I've just been procrastinating. I think I just need to put something up there, to be honest.
Yeah, I suppose it's a good point you bring up, because I don't know what the sort of reasoning behind a lot of people being annoyed that a game is short. I think in some cases a lot of people are quite spoiled to the fact that they have such long games nowadays. I think service games are a real testament to that. But like, there's some really fantastic games like in the mainstream that are quite short. Like at least one that comes to mind is Ben Esposito, who obviously, as you did Edith Finch. Like one of his more recent games, Donut County, is only I think about at maximum 4 hours long.
Yeah.
And like it's a fantastic game.
Fantastic.
But like the only reason I always see that like the one thing developers won't put games up on Steam that are short is because I think you can play up to 4 hours of a game and you can refund it up until then, which is a really poor, shoddy service that Steam really needs to address. Because like it's detrimental to a lot of people. Because I've seen, I'm sure you have as well on like Twitter as well, people will refund a game and say, oh, it's great, but it's just too short. It's like, well, then why are you refunding it? Like,
absolutely.
And it's usually it's not for the big points, but it's never really for the big sort of AAA stuff. It's always the indie developers that get kind of shafted by that as well, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. I've seen people, especially for free stuff, as I've seen people complain about it, going, "Oh, it's too short," but it's like, you got it for free, and it was short. You didn't lose hours over it, and you didn't lose money either. So, I don't understand it. I think the refund model that they have as well is a bit crap. I can understand if you're playing a game and it's broken and things like that, or if there's like game breaking bugs, that's understandable. But if you have a fully playable game and you happen to finish it, let's say it's only 2.5 hours long or 3 hours long, and you refund it, it's a bit of a kick in the teeth.
Yeah.
To the developer as well. Because there's a lot of like really like lovingly crafted games that you could finish in 2 hours. So yeah, it's kind of a kick in the teeth.
Yeah. I think I personally, if you like, obviously it's up to yourself, like whenever you get around to it, but it'd be brilliant to see like even you just, because you obviously say that your games are quite short, even if you just put up a collection of a load of your games into one like big sort of file, because I know obviously Harmless, so you have 2 of those iterations now at the moment, and by all accounts I see that they're probably outside of DreadX Collection, they're sort of 2 of your big popular ones at the moment. Which I suppose is a good thing considering they're your most recent ones, so it shows that popularity is rising. But you've a lot of other sort of games as well, like side scroller platformers, top down games as well. Like, would it ever sort of appeal to you in some sense to do something like that? Maybe have it, well, not your own DreadX collection, but like your own sort of Dan McGrath collection.
You call it the Dan X collection. Well, the thing is, funny that you brought it up. So my plan is that my next game, that I was kind of working on something before the DreadX collection started. So I was actually working on a third Harmful game, because like for some reason I can't seem to get away from that theme and that story. So the plan was actually to make a third one and put it on Steam, but also integrate the first and second one into the third one, so they're playable inside the third one. So it is something I think that will happen in the future, hopefully.
Yeah, it's almost it's almost like when you see like a remastered collection gets brought over to like a new console or something, it's like, oh, here's the third one, but you can play these other 2 on the side as well.
Yeah. So that's exactly the plan. I don't know how well that will go down, but I suppose time will tell. Which that's the plan, yeah.
I suppose if Twitter and the DreadX collection are anything to go by, people are yearning for more Dan McGrath content. So I think you'll be fine with regards to getting people to play it anyways.
I certainly hope so.
This is it's more of a sort of a long-term question, and it's perfectly fine if you don't have a fully fledged out answer to it, but is there a long-term goal you're working towards as a game developer, or are you just kind of seeing where each opportunity takes you?
I would love to do it full time. That's always been my goal. Like if I could get like a role at a company or some indie companies like that, it'd be great. But my kind of ideal, like my number one goal is to kind of be like I can like survive on it. That's kind of the main. Like even if I had a Patreon, that kind of thing, where like a small Patreon where you make a certain amount a month and I can pay the rent. That's that's my main goal. So I can keep doing the weird things that I'm doing, because I have a lot of ideas and a lot of avenues that I'd like to explore. So that's kind of the main goal. Now I suppose over the last, when I first started, I was way more serious. I was like, I have to get this, And I think I've become a little more laid back over the last 3 or 4 years, which I think has actually benefited my work, because I don't put as much pressure on myself anymore. So it's a long way of answering. Yes, I want to be self-sufficient, or make money, or just survive off them.
And do you think being sort of like self-sufficient in the games industry is feasible in Ireland, or is that something you'd have to look at, even moving away for?
I think nowadays, I think more than ever nowadays, I think it's becoming, to me anyway, it seems like it's becoming easier and easier to be self-sufficient through the internet, working at home, having a Patreon or a specific YouTube. Like loads of people have proved that, like developers like Puppet Combo and things like that. They've proved to be self-sufficient by just existing. It has nothing to do with their location. I'd love to maybe set up a studio or something someday, in Ireland, which I think would be pretty cool. Because I do think, as you were saying earlier about, like Dark Side Detective and all these kind of things, there is a lot of cool stuff and a lot of really good developers in the country. It's just that there's not a lot of fanfare about it, or it's just not known, unfortunately.
Yeah, because I think even like as you even look at it as not just a medium, but more so as an industry. Like I think recently I think the most recent government budget there was like I think 22 million set aside for like the games industry in Ireland. Because I remember that being like, it's like, what's going on here? Like this is really random to see this in the budget. But maybe it's something that is obviously getting more traction. I think time will only tell in Ireland whether it starts to kick off or not. I think broadband is probably going to be the biggest drawback for that, though, for a lot of them, though. But outside of that, you mentioned the sort of setting up a Patreon page. Is that something you've looked into, or something you're looking into doing in the future?
It's something I've looked into, and I potentially may do in the future. I think I might try and just build my audience up a little bit more, so that people would actually use it instead of me having two patrons, even though I'd be eternally grateful to those two patrons. But yeah, I think I might do it in the future, hopefully maybe this year.
I have two final questions I want to get on to now. They're kind of more just sort of I suppose fun would be the word, but I don't think I've asked anything too serious throughout the interview anyways. If you had to say, you could collaborate with anyone in the gaming industry to date, any dev, whatnot, who would you pick and why, and maybe what sort of game would you like to do with them?
Oh my god, what a question. There are so many. Oh my god, we might have to we'll go for a quick break there. Jeez, that's a great question. I think one of my favorite companies always has been, as you could probably tell, what I was talking about earlier, is Bungie. I've always been a big Bungie fan, because I love Halo and the Destiny games. I think any of those kind of original people who worked there, like Jason Jones, I would love to work with them, because I think they have, not so much, I'm not talking bad about Bungie nowadays, but Bungie kind of between 2001 2007 did a great kind of work ethic, and they kind of knew what they were doing. If we could work with any of those people, like Jamie Griezmer or any of those kind of guys, I'd love to work with them. As for, I think, maybe indie developers, there's a good few. I'd love to work with Airdorf. We seem to be on the same page with priests, so I'd love to see what we could do. There's a few people from the DreadX collection as well that I'd love to work with. Obviously, I'd love to work with Dave. I'd love to work with Torpilduke, and Chris and Philip. Philip made the Axis Mundi, the photo game.
Oh yes, yeah.
And Mr. Pink. I'd love to work with Mr. Pink.
That was the weirdest game on the collection, I have to admit. It was the one that took me completely off the wall. Like,
I love it. I absolutely love it. I remember his original. I won't go into too much detail, but his original pitch, I had no idea what he was making. And then I kind of, as time went on, I was like, I still have no idea what he's making. And I actually sat down and I played it, and I was like, this is great, but I still don't know what he's made. But I love it. So those are kind of people I'd love to work with. Yeah, I can't think of any others.
And I think, I suppose my final question, I could ask you questions all day because this has been extremely interesting and I've loved every second of it. But, I think it's fairly clear from anyone who's played your games or been listening to you here, like that horror is your very core genre that you'll, thrive in. Is there any other genre you'd love to stretch out to? I know you said you're a big fan of the Halo titles. Is sci-fi sort of action something you'd like to look at as well, or?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Sci-fi action kind of stuff would be. I'd love to delve into that kind of thing. I've always thought about doing like a story-based shooter, a big sci-fi thing, kind of like Marathon or or Doom or like Halo or something like that. But I'd love to do a sci-fi shooter at some point, or some kind of like immersive sim, kind of like Deus Ex or something like that. I love those games. Big fan of those. Horror I've only kind of gotten into horror game development over kind of the last 2 years. It's kind of something I always wanted to do, and I kind of accidentally fell into it. Which sci-fi is something. It's on the back burner at the moment when I figure out the horror stuff.
I suppose just before we go, I have one extra question that just came to my head there now. You obviously mentioned at the beginning that you kind of try and recreate sort of the sort of PS1 poly style that you kind of grew up with. Do you think that horror games in general really they thrive in that sort of era of graphics because it's so easy to make something look horrifying because it's not very high rendered? Like, do you think that's something that maybe, like, I think examples nowadays that I think of in terms of semi decent horror games that have been successful, like Amnesia, what's the one, the camera where you go into the asylum, I'm forgetting it now, Outlast, Outlast, like they've been sort of the two standouts, but a lot of the time they tend to have some weird bugs, or the models look a bit too polished to the fact that it doesn't seem believable. But this sort of grainy look kind of, I think Harmless is a perfect example of this, really lends itself into the horror.
I think so. Yeah, I think you can definitely cover up a lot of bugs with it. It's kind of expected. If you see a bug, you kind of go, that's okay. That would have happened back then, Whereas if you see it in Outlast, you're like, this game is broken. I'm going to refund it on Steam. I think there's a weirdness to it as well. There's kind of an uncomfortable sense to things as well. And I think that you can use a lot of the pixelness of it, and like kind of the low draw distance, kind of the player kind of fills in the gaps, which is a big thing. And their imagination fills in the gaps with a lot of things, the art style or like the atmosphere and those kind of things. I think it lends itself really well. I remember there were games on PS1. I remember like Silent Hill. I did not play Silent Hill until I was in my late teens because I was terrified of it. Absolutely. And there were games as well that weren't even horror games, but they terrified me because of the look of them when I was a kid. Like there's that game, the RPG. Is it Vagrant Story? It's called. Great game. Not a horror in any aspect. I was terrified of it as a kid because of the dark hallways and corridors. I didn't know what was at the end of the corridor. So I think it lends itself really well to the horror genre. I think it's almost a perfect style for it. Personally, I would think.
Well, Dan, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I've enjoyed every second of it. I think everyone has to go and check out the latest DreadX collection, but also the continued work you've done as a gaming developer. Just quickly at the end, where can people sort of find you online, or if they want to support you in any way, how can they do that?
So I'm on Twitter. My handle is DanInFiction. You can find me there. I post a little too much, but I'm usually always active on there. And you can find me on itch.io. It's toothandclaw.itch.io. There.
Perfect, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that.